Second Nature, the boys are back. Episode 16. After a week off, we are rested and ready. Aaron Lutzy, good to see you, buddy. Here we are. We're back again. Tell the people why I'm sure disappointed them by not showing up in their podcast feed last week.
We ruined everyone's lives by not showing up, but it's not our fault. It's not our fault. It's the fault of the Telluride library and their lack of podcast studio.
At least lack of podcast capable connection and Wi-Fi infrastructure. You'd think that a town that, has so much public investment and so much wealth sloshing around that they would have really good Wi-Fi, but no such luck. And of course, we're kidding. I spent all week working in the public library here in Telluride. We tried to record a podcast, but we couldn't get it done last week. So we apologize.
You know what? It was a warm up for this one, and we're going to absolutely crush this podcast because honestly, you and I had two absolutely massive weeks. You were at two events creating content, and then you ran an industry conference, and I drove from coast to coast. And I think both of us, even while we were trying to make that podcast happen, we were kind of looking at each other just like, I'm nuked. And so to give ourselves a couple extra days to get this one done, it's going to be
absolutely worth it. So let's jump right to it, okay? In the spirit of Second Nature, we figured that we would go through the two massive projects that you and I are both emerging from for our individual sort of consumer-facing media businesses. Yours, of course, Super Rider, mine, Free Trail, in the mountain biking and trail running space, respectively. Lutzy, we obviously talked before you left on your trip about this cross-country road trip, what it meant for the channel. And I'm sure the audience would love to hear any learnings, lessons that came on that 3,000-mile coast-to-coast journey.
Boy, were there ever some lessons. I just to give some context for the listeners that maybe didn't know, I decided that I wanted to do a coast-to-coast road trip with my oldest son to teach him how to mountain bike, because the Super Rider channel is all about helping people become better, more confident mountain bikers. And I do a lot of tutorials on there that I think are beginner level tutorials and up to help people get better at riding bikes. And my idea was to have this big project where I take someone from zero to hero to teach someone who's never ridden and then teach them all the things that I know. And although I've had this channel for a long time, it's always been specific tutorial content, not really ever a project. And we've talked in the past about the difference between competitive athletes and project athletes. And I love the project side of project athletes. And I wanted to start building out more projects on my channel. And of course, I couldn't go mellow. I had to do a 2-week all-in project like this with no turning back after we started. And if I'm honest, I sort of felt like I wanted to turn back after the first day or two. The reason why is that I substantially underestimated what it means to be a beginner in mountain biking, which ultimately led to some of the biggest sort of awakenings that I had as my business, as an educator, as a content creator, what it actually means to be a beginner and how I might further address that. So we got on the start of this road trip. Where I thought we were going to start and where I thought I was going to start teaching stuff was pretty far away from where we actually started. And I sort of had to reset my expectations and be extremely patient to help get my son up to the level where we could really start working on some of that stuff. And we eventually made it across the country in one piece, no big crashes. We high-fived a lot of other creators, a lot of athletes, went to some of the factories and businesses that I work with in Super Rider and beyond, and had this really cool father-son bonding experience. But the most impactful thing I think that came from this is this idea of how I might better serve the entry-level athletes that are coming into the sport of mountain biking, because I realized through this process that actually I'm serving kind of the intermediate level, and the maximum audience is going to be at that top of the funnel, the people that are just getting into mountain biking. And how might I think to serve them, to help them get over the hump of getting into the sport and getting really excited about it? That was the kind of stuff I was thinking about. That was the stuff I was taking notes. And a lot of it came from my oldest son asking me or referencing a part of the bike but it was like he'd say the wrong word for it. He would say something really funny, but it wasn't correct. And so I would take a note like, okay, I got to teach people what the names of the tubes of the bikes are, or like the derailleur, the thing that shifts your gears in the back. We got to talk about what that's actually called and what it's for and how you use it. And so there are a lot of things that, you and I probably take for granted about the sports that we participate in because it's been so long since we were day one of the sport. And really the most important thing that came out of this trip was understanding that, which represents a massive business opportunity for me as an educator. And we're going to come back to that later in this episode because I have another thing that I'm working on that's sort of related to that. But that was for sure the thing that was most important. Now, from the business side of thing, I'm going to come out with 10 or 12 episodes, so there's going to be a mountain of content that's all sponsored by multiple brands. And I met and developed relationships with even more brands on this trip. So a lot of stuff came out of this, but I actually think the most important thing to come out of it is probably that course that I'm going to create for entry level mountain bikers to help more people come into the sport. And as a result of that, they'll stay kind of in the super rider ecosystem. The last thing I want to say is a huge thank you to Kara, my wife, who held it down at the house for 2 weeks. We have two kids here at the house, and she just held it all together while I was gone and did an excellent job. Honestly, like not even a peep of being like super bummed. She was 1000% supportive. And this project was kind of what I needed to really springboard into all of the content that I'm going to be making and into the business. And so having that support at home, which I know having that backup is the most important thing. So huge
Shout
shout out
out
to
to
Kara.
Kara. It truly is a team effort. And of course, we've talked in multiple episodes about how you left your very comfortable corporate gig to pursue this full-time content creator lifestyle. And you're off to a hot start. And of course, Kara's got to backstop you on all these big projects. And certainly it's the same for me and Harmony. And we certainly appreciate it. You were talking about the top of the funnel. Of course, the content is the top of the funnel. You're about to go into the reign of terror. You mentioned this, so fill the audience in, remind them what the reign of terror is and what the next couple of weeks look like as you sift through this new archive of cross-country mountain biking content.
Yeah, so the best part about traveling around is riding your bike and filming everything. But then reality sets in when you come home and you realize, like, oh, I've got 3 full hard drives worth of content that I need to edit all together to make a coherent piece of content. And the reign of terror is basically when you lock yourself in the room and you don't come out until it's done. There's a great example of Sylvester Stallone doing the same thing. He wrote the script of Rocky in 3 days. He painted his windows black so he couldn't see what time it was. It was just time for writing. And he was able to get that first draft done in 3 days and then, had something to show people. And that's sort of what I'm going to do. I'm not going to go so extreme just to paint the windows of my house, but I am probably going to lock the door and not come out until I have something to show. Now, the first thing I'm probably going to do as an organizing principle is create one piece of content that kind of summarizes the entire trip. And I'll write a script that goes with that and pull pieces of content from every day of the trip and put it together as one overarching piece, which I think will be the most interesting. It will be zero to hero on a mountain bike. It will be father son. It will be cross country road trip, all in one piece to bring in the maximum amount of people, because I think that's the most interesting to everybody, and it kind of makes it all uh, nice and tidy. But what I'll do after that, because I think that'll be the best one out of everything, then I'll go into individual episodes. So episode 1 will be day 1, episode 2 day 2, et cetera, and people can dig into a little bit more of the details and the behind the scenes kind of vibe that went through it. But I'm going to start with my best thing so that I can bring the most people along for the ride instead of doing that at the very end. I think it makes sense to actually do the highlight reel to start and then provide the more exploded out versions of each day along the trip. So that's coming up next, and that will be probably the next 2 to 3 months worth of content on my channel.
Heck yeah, buddy. Well, now with this new vision serving the entry level, top of funnel, maybe up to intermediate level athlete, I feel like I could be a guinea pig and you could start coaching up your boy. Harmony and I
I'm
have been
ready.
talking about how I want to get a mountain bike. As we get older, these big trail runs get a little bit harder to absorb for the bones and the soft tissues of our aging bodies. So supplementing it with maybe a little mountain biking would be helpful, and I can learn all those skills on the Super Rider tutorials. Anyway, well, dude, congratulations. Good to catch up on that. Obviously, I had a massive couple weeks also. I don't know where you want me to dive in, if you want me to just launch into a soliloquy, or if you have any questions for me that I can.
I would say go to town on all of the things. Give me the top line. I definitely have a lot of questions about TrailCon, the industry conference that you put on, and I think that will be the most interesting. But I'm really curious to hear from you, kind of what were the highlights. It's you were at two major races, you broke some records, and you put on a conference. I mean, you could start just about anywhere, and we can kind of dig in. But what
Yeah,
stands
so
out to
I
you?
guess it was probably episode 14 where we described our respective trips as the biggest projects we've ever undertaken. Sort of serendipitous that they happened simultaneously. So for those who didn't listen to episode 14, my business, Free Trail, we've sort of like emerged into a space where we're healthy after 3 years of really battling and uphill to discover a sustainable business model. And I think through all that hard work, brands have sort of recognized our voice and have been willing to support our stuff. And this year, especially Hoka really stepped up to help us elevate our coverage of two of North America's most important racing events. So on back-to-back weekends in the Tahoe area is the Broken Arrow Sky Race and then the Western States 100. Not coincidentally, those two races, I mean, Western States is the most historic and unquestionably the most important trail race in North America and one of the most important races in the world. And Broken Arrow in the last 8 years has also become, in that sort of next category, not quite a Western States, but certainly one of the most important races in North America. And we recognize a great opportunity to, do a coherent, comprehensive bit of coverage that traverse that entire week, separating these two massively important events, talking to the athletes, the race directors, doing commentary and analysis on the performance of the top athletes, and really just like packaging a narrative that, again, top of funnel. So we could speak to the next generation of trail runners, people who are just discovering the sport, and we could share with them what makes these individual races important and special, and thereby also communicate what makes the sport special. So we were able to do that through that entire week. Broken Arrow went into Western States week. We call this trailgating. The vision is basically to bring college game day style coverage to our wonderful sport. So it's lighthearted, it's free flowing, it has fun sort of segments where we make predictions and, do deep analysis on the history and the fields and what might happen, and try and entertain and inform a trail running audience along the way. It was massively important for us. We definitely were able to take our game to the next level. I haven't done a deep dive on the numbers, but just subjectively, it's felt like, Free Trail is in a position to where when people are looking for trail running information, we're at least one of the first people they think of. And that makes me really proud after 3 years of truly slogging away on the business. Also, you mentioned TrailCon was in the middle of the week. We can talk about that individually. But the final bookend that I wanted to add was I also co-host the first 18, 19 hours of the Western States 100 broadcast, which is truly an honor and something that I look forward to every single year. That is one of the highlights of my year every single year. And this year was next level. We took the broadcast into, what felt like a new era in terms of the technology and the coverage and the pictures we were able to get, while also, still staying true to the grassroots vibe of the sport and packaging what turned into one of the most dramatic trail races in recent memory to really bring that race into a mainstream consciousness was something that is always just a complete honor and privilege for me. And we did break a bunch of records in terms of overall viewership and stuff there too. So not
Wasn't it the number one? It was the number one live streamed sports event of the
Yes, it was
weekend.
on that Saturday, June 29th, it was the number one sports related live stream on YouTube, which is pretty remarkable to think about.
Yeah, isn't it the same weekend as the Olympic trials?
Yeah, I don't know if we were actually competing against the Olympic trials in that category on YouTube. Maybe.
I mean, it is a live stream sports event. I mean, just another reason why you're first in line for a commentator on the MBDC when trail running makes it into the Olympics. Yeah, you got
Yeah.
my vote.
Anyway, it was a super successful weekend on the content front, and yeah, just to have the cherry on top of doing the broadcast itself. It's funny, and maybe this can tie it back to TrailCon, but peak viewership during the live stream is like 25,000 people. And it's like no big deal to me. It's a total shrug. I'm absolutely in my element, love every minute of it. But for some reason, TrailCon made me super stressed leading into the race. You actually were the one who sort of coached me up around it. So we can get to that. But it was kind of hilarious, sitting on a stage in front of a few hundred, you know, of my colleagues and people who I know personally for whatever reason made me a lot more uneasy than sitting on a live stream with 25,000 people watching me. So, yeah.
Amazing. Well, before we go to TrailCon, I had one question. You mentioned that Hoka was the presenting partner, or was super engaged with the trailgating content that you did for Broken Arrow and for Western States. Was that their entire investment for the activation with both those events, or did they have other stuff that they were also working on? What does that look like when you're at an event like Western States and you've got a brand like Hoka? I'm sure they have a booth or a tent somewhere as well. But what is their entire activation? Are they giving you 100% of the activation and being like, you're in charge of making us awesome at Western States? Or do you supplement each other when it comes to long form, short form? Can you give us a little bit more on that?
Well, so the coolest thing, Aaron, that I didn't even mention is they built us a studio in the coolest coffee shop in Olympic Valley, this place called Coffee Bar. They called it the Hoka Saloon. So Free Trail was creating the content and creating our headquarters at the Hoka Saloon in the Coffee Bar in Olympic Valley, which to me, as somebody who's a lifelong consumer of sports media, was just a pinch me moment. So they sort of had that as their sort of center of activation throughout race week. Of course, they did a lot around the race expo as well, where runners could interact with their product and both footwear and apparel. And then obviously they had a lot of top athletes in the race. They actually had 4 of the 6 podium positions. So really successful week for Hoka. And then I think they did a couple other more activations with other media entities, people who are more gear oriented. I know like Believe in the Run, I think they did something with, and also iRunFar, who does great race coverage on race day. So we were part of a broader ecosystem of activation that helped to bring one of the most important events to life within the Hoka portfolio. So yeah, obviously we couldn't have done it without the brand. It helped us learn a lot about what those brand priorities are, and then move forward with, okay, how can we be maximally valuable to our brand partners?
I always find that interesting to think about how a brand approaches a marquee event like that and how they build out their activation and how much they put their trust in individual entities for all that stuff too.
Yeah, I mean, it was fantastic. And I can't say enough about how much we enjoy working with the people at Hoka, top to bottom, and grateful for their support. And yeah, like I said, we learned a lot. It wasn't totally perfect, but absolutely a breakthrough for Free Trail in a lot of different ways. And I'm still like pretty exhausted from the whole thing. And now this weekend is the Hard Rock 100, where we're going to be kind of launching into it again. So no rest for the wicked, as they say.
Back to back to
Pretty
back.
much.
let's hear about TrailCon now. I want to hear about, just give me the primer. We know that this was a conference. This was the taste of TrailCon. This was your kind of first attempt at putting this thing out into the world and really just kind of putting the flag in the sand. I know that you have way bigger visions for TrailCon, but this was kind of your first run at it. How did it go? And what were sort of the takeaways that you had?
Yeah, so I'll just go high level because we're going to have Brendan Madigan on the show in the next couple of weeks, who was one of our partners in bringing this to life and somebody who I've always deeply admired in the outdoor industry in a lot of different ways. He's also the owner of Alpenglow Sports, a sort of very core mountain sport specialty retail shop in the Tahoe area. And he's the race director of the Broken Arrow Sky Race, the race that we've mentioned now a few times. So Brendan will come on the show and we'll talk in more depth about it. But yeah, so for our viewing audience, we talked many episodes ago about the Sea Otter Classic and mountain biking and how I've always felt like there needs to be something similar in trail running. And we've talked also about how Doug, Brendan, and myself sort of came together to try and bring this to life. So the way that it looked, ultimately, we had some learnings, to sort of cut to the chase. We had 379 total people register, which blew us away. Unfortunately, we probably only had like 270 people show. So this was a big learning. It was a free event. So there's no friction to sign up, meaning a lot of people can just bail at the last minute or whatever. But the win there was it was still significantly more than we anticipated. So we ended up having, like I said, about 270. So the room still felt full. We had a incredibly talented group of panelists, and this is, I think, something that gives us all optimism that we're onto something with TrailCon, and that we had buy-in from really the most influential minds in the sport of trail running, and they all offered a lot of great insight. Another key learning was that the panels were a bit too short, especially for the talent that we had on them. But again, it's the taste of TrailCon. We were learning on the fly, and overall, the feedback that I've received has been very positive. We sent out a survey to the participants this week. I haven't had a chance to see those come through, but just the subjective feedback from our attendees who took the time to reach out to me made it feel like, okay, this is hopefully going to be something that's important for our industry moving forward. And obviously, with Freetrail being attached to it, that by definition makes it important for our business. So it's one of those things where, at the end of the day, we lost a ton of money on it. We view it as an investment in the future. And we would love it if it could both be a massive service to the global trail running community and also something that's supportive of our business, both for Freetrail, for Brendan and what he does, and for Doug and what he does. So that's the high level on TrailCon. Any follow-ups, or should we save it for Brendan?
We can save some of it for Brendan. Here's my plug for a Second Nature panel next year, maybe a live pod. I
Well,
don't know. What do you think we
so
should do?
that was my favorite panel. The one that you were intended to be on, the Brandon Athlete panel, was really, really
Mhm.
cool and had great insight. And also, as the moderator, it created some organic back and forth on the panel where panelists would ask each other questions. So you could tell that everybody was really engaged. And just by virtue of my history as being a professional athlete and working with people like you and being interested in that overlap of, where good partnerships are created between brands and athletes, that one was my favorite part. And I think we could go much deeper at next year's TrailCon with Lutzi in attendance.
I'm there. I'm already in, signing up now. Number one, what do you think? Is it going to be same thing, just a handful of panels, or do you think you'll go a full day? Will it be multiple days? Like, what's the vision for where you want to take TrailCon? Can you give us a
Let's
preview?
save that for Brendan. High level, we
All
do
right.
want it to be multiple days. We do want it to have both consumer and B2B elements of it, much like Sea Otter does. So let's save that for Brendan so that we're not doing too many replays and we can bump forward to. I wanted to talk about the Raid Research Pod first before we get
Oh
to
yeah, yeah.
the brand classroom textbook moment that you're going to give us as it relates to the Olympic trials. But that raid episode, man, was so good. You're on such a heater. I'm so bummed I keep missing these interviews, but I feel like if I joined, I may bring the whole energy down. And I think
It,
the thing that I wanted to tee up to you and just like really reinforce for the audience is just how all in Kyle Siegel is. So to our listeners, if you missed last episode with Kyle Siegel, the founder of Raid Research, one of the things that he said, and he kind of just glances on it and skips over it, is that he has taken out a personal loan against the business that he has, personal responsibility for. In other words, if Raid Research fails and he's unable to pay back the loan, Kyle has collateralized that loan with his own house, meaning he's so all in that if his business fails, he also loses his house. And I think this is such a great example of what it takes, especially when you're in a competitive market like he is, creating outdoor equipment, backpacks in his case now, and looking forward maybe in outerwear, other product categories. But I think that it's just an important thing for our viewers and listeners to know. It's certainly something that I learned the hard way when building my business, and something that I think Kyle really does a good job of just like being real about where the business is, where it's headed, and the personal sacrifice that it's going to take for him to achieve his dream. Anything you want to add there?
I think he said that at the very end as well, where I kind of had like, all right, any last bits of advice for people who are kind of interested in going down this? Because I said this at the beginning of that episode, but I feel like everybody who cares about the outdoor industry probably also wants to own an outdoor industry brand, just as like a dream of one day having their own outdoor brand, right? I just feel like it comes with so many of the people that join this industry of like, I'll work for this brand, but I would love to do XYZ. And one of the things that he said that really stood out to me was like, the best advice I can give you is if you're not all in, don't do it. Don't go in unless you literally cannot do anything. You have to do this thing. You have to want it more than anything else, because the effort that actually goes into creating an outdoor brand is substantial. And if you're not willing to put it all on the line, if you're not willing to put 2000% into this whole thing, you're not going to succeed. And you have to be ready to put it all on the line. And he's obviously living that example right now, but I think he's right. I think you can't just make it a side hustle that you're going to start a outdoor brand. It has to be all in, full focus to get it to where it is, because you're competing against entire teams of people that's their full-time job, and you want to do this solo. Like, if you look at it from that perspective, holy crap.
Yeah, I thought the other thing that was really interesting was about the equity component. As a
Mhm.
founder owner of the business, he said he has two investors. He wishes he only had one. And it reminded me of something that we talked about on our last episode together, where I had listened to this podcast that helped me think about what are you optimizing for and the trade offs inherent in every business decision that you make, especially as an owner operator. And in his case, the trade off that he's making is retaining as much ownership as he possibly can, therefore not having as much funding and financing to launch into the next category of growth and compete against some of the more name brand brands in the space. And I thought that was also just something that can evolve over time, that is interesting to think about. And when you're creating a brand from the ground up, you really do have to think about those trade-offs and what are you optimizing for. And for him, it feels like he has more important to him than a huge financial win down the road is executing against a vision that he has in his head. In other words, it would probably be easier for him to take more investment capital, lose some of the ownership over the business, take it into the stratosphere and try and sell it. And for him, it was interesting too, because he also contrasted his brand with sort of a cottage maker brand of somebody who just hacks away on things in their garage. Like he wants to be an established, recognizable brand in the space, but not necessarily use that same playbook of taking a bunch of capital, financing a bunch of growth, and hoping the business eventually catches up. Instead, he's building a business, building a very solid foundation. And this is unquestionably the harder way to go, is what Kyle's doing. But for him, it's more important because he can actually execute against the vision that he has and not lose control over the ability to chase that vision. So, again, very interesting way to sort of encapsulate this idea of what are you optimizing for and the trade offs inherent in every business decision, because it's never clean cut.
It's like that line we had before. Anything worth doing is worth doing slowly. And what is the rush? What's the rush to go compete against the big dogs right away? Like, better to get it right, get your product, get your brand, get your foundation in place, and then make your way on to compete with the big dogs. Like,
But
why
well,
why
that's so
rush it?
much easier said than done. And I'll provide an example from my experience building our business as a way to maybe illustrate this for our listeners. But when you've got a huge loan hanging over your head that you need to pay back, the impulse, at least for me, would be to not go slow. It would be, I need to grow this business. I need to pay off this freaking loan so I don't lose my house. Same thing happened
Mhm.
with Freetrail. You know, I self-funded our whole business from day one. I didn't pay myself or my wife, who works full time on the business, for 3 years. And when that's the case, and you see your annual income go down 90% and stay there for 3 years, and the only thing you have is a vision and a belief and a feeling that like this is going to be worth it, it's not easy. And the impulse for me has always been push, 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 faster, faster, faster. We need to get to a point where this is financially sustainable. Otherwise, we need to stop. And so anyway, I just think that that's an important, just maybe way to illustrate it for the audience, because like what Kyle's doing, like I said earlier, is much harder than taking a bunch of money, building something cool that still has some of your vision on it, but making some trade-offs, having to get feedback from people who are also own equity partners in the business, those being investors. And I don't know. I just admire what he's doing.
Yeah, absolutely. I also think that I see where you're coming from. I also think that in the cases where people have taken on investment and they have more money to spend, it doesn't necessarily always equal out to being a better situation. In fact, a lot of brands have almost too much money and then they blow it on dumb stuff, and then they're, moving at the same pace or even slower than some of the small brands that have to be really creative and strategic with the money that they do have. And so, not to say that it's a curse to have proper financing and funding, but it doesn't always equal out to being the answer. And, you didn't take financing for Free Trail, and I think that was the right thing, because now you're in the direction where it is making money, and you don't have anybody else's opinion necessarily weighing down the direction of Free Trail. Whereas if somebody was in there, they'd be pushing you maybe to do stuff that was not in line with what the brand was trying to do, and you kind of shoot yourself in the foot when you take the easy way out on some
Yeah.
of that stuff.
Okay. Two more quick things. I wanted to just say, I can't wait to try his run product. I can't wait to see it. I sent him an email after listening to the pod finally and said, all right, dude, send me some product. Let's give this thing a test. And the other thing I wanted to say is that I think we should have, occasional episodes that are like the one you did with Kyle, that are like startup spotlights. So if you are listening to this and if you're tinkering on your own little brand and you want to talk about it, it doesn't necessarily have to be something that, reveals any trade secrets, but more just, to reveal the important and real parts of building a business from the ground up. We would love to chat with you. Hit us up on Instagram, secondnature.media. Lucy, let's transition. You were bending my ear on something awesome that was going on at the Olympic trials, opening the floor to you. Tell the people about the brand, the activation, why you thought it was powerful.
Well, I have to be fair here. Although I'm definitely paying attention to this brand and wanted to talk about it and definitely told you about it, most of our Instagram audience also wants us to talk about it. I have a substantial amount of DMs in the Second Nature account of people sharing Jordan Rogers' post about the Bandit Olympic Trials unsponsored project. And that's what we're going to talk about. So, for those who aren't familiar, there's a running brand in New York called Bandit. And what they did this year at the Olympic trials in Eugene, Oregon, they put 35 athletes in head to toe kits that were black. And so the idea was instead of an unsponsored athlete going to the Olympic trials wearing something that they bought at a sporting goods store that was either Nike or Adidas branded and potentially qualifying for the Olympics and then getting exposure for Adidas or Nike or whoever, they would be in an all black kit. And that would signify to the sponsors that were in Eugene at the event that this athlete is unsponsored and they're going to the Olympics. And so by having this sort of blacked out kit, it was a signal like, hey, I'm a free agent essentially, and I'm looking for this. And so that was a huge deal. Jordan Rogers, another creator that we follow and pay close attention to, he did a big piece on it, got millions of views, kind of showing what Bandit had done, showing the kits, talking about how it was a great idea. But then I listened to a podcast with Jordan and a few other brand people, and they brought on Tim Rossi, who's the marketing guy from Bandit. And we got a little bit more detail about this. There's a few things that really stood out to me because you can see this Bandit activation happening, which I think is really clever and interesting and sort of like ambush marketing in a way, because, this is like, I mean, Eugene, Oregon is literally Nike's, that's their stomping grounds. And to come in and do something that takes the spotlight off of Nike in a place like the Olympic trials is absolutely an ambush. But I love this stuff. So, what I think is sort of the most interesting thing, this is actually not the first time that Bandit has done this unsponsored project. It's for sure the most successful time they've done it. But actually, last year they did the same thing, but they only got 9 athletes and they only had black tops, so not the full kit. So they made some forward progress with this concept, and surely the execution was night and day different this time around. I didn't know this, but there's only 11 people that work for Bandit, and only 3 of those people are marketing employees. So it's pretty substantial output for such a small team, which I think is really interesting. One of the misses that I think Bandit had though was, and the athlete marketing guy goes to this of like, you had to go hunt down those 35 people and get their sizes, get their gear, connect with them before the event, which means that you probably talked to them at other events earlier in the season, which probably took a lot of back and forth emailing and however it took to get this thing pulled together. But what they didn't do is they didn't sell the unsponsored gear. So the only way that you could have gotten, as far as I can tell, the only way you could have gotten this blackout kit is if you were in contact with Bandit. And I sort of wonder if this idea works this well, why wouldn't they be selling it? Because I think there's a ton of unsponsored people out there and they could really run with this concept, right? All the people that are unsponsored, and this is now a signal like, oh, if you show up at a track meet in an all black kit, that means you're available. I could see this outselling everything else that they have because there are a lot of unsponsored athletes out there that are doing incredible stuff. So I think that what they did so far with the Olympic trials was incredible and they had a great result. But I think that there's a bigger opportunity here for them to own that space, because what's stopping Hoka from doing an all black kit that says unsponsored on the front of it and selling that? And they could just literally hijack the high, they could ambush the ambush marketing basically. And I mean, any brand could do it. It could be, it doesn't even matter. But I think that's a big opportunity that's still kind of out there that they should probably be taking into account if they haven't already, because there are surely more than 35 athletes in track and field who are not sponsored. And going into Michael Johnson's new series, the Grand Slam track, another opportunity to really, really be visible. So That's my
Okay,
two
so
cents.
a couple of things here. It reminds me of the concept of the anti brand that you've talked about on the pod a couple of times, where
Mhm.
even with a completely unbranded logoless kit, you know that it's Bandit, right? So it's like
Yep.
even without a logo, it's logoed, at least in the mind of the consumer and the fan. So brilliant, brilliant stuff. The thing that I thought about when you were saying that maybe a miss was not commercializing the product, I know there are very stringent rules about brands' abilities to do that, especially around things like the Olympic trials. I think we actually talked about this on the podcast before because Nike obviously owns the brand partnerships with USA Track and Field, and I think with the US Olympic Committee as a whole. So they pretty much outfit almost every single sport that goes to the Olympics. I know there are some exceptions. For example, I think the North Face is still the apparel partner for USA Climbing. But my point is that maybe there is sort of a blackout on competitive brands, in other words, non Nike brands, in their ability to commercialize products around the Olympic trials, or at least use that as a marketing channel.
The the Olympics for sure, there's a team kit that they all have to wear. So actually, like Bandit, this is their only bite at the apple. They can't do anything at the Olympics. If you're a Bandit athlete, an Adidas athlete, an on running athlete, you still have to wear a Nike kit at the Olympics. That's sort of set in stone. But as far as I know, the trials is still wide open, which is why they're you can wear whatever you
Right.
need.
So anyway, my point is that obviously they're smart enough to know, oh well, maybe we should sell this product. There's probably a reason why they didn't, and maybe something that our listeners will have information about. The other thing, I think I've mentioned this on the podcast before, but I had dinner with Nick West, the CEO of Bandit, at the running event last fall in Austin, Texas. It was part of a group from Ketone IQ and a bunch of the partners who work with them, including Free Trail and Bandit. And I happened to sit across the table from both him and Michael Brandt, the CEO of Ketone IQ. And we had what I thought were really interesting conversations. And I had a chance to talk to Nick. And I should say, my dream, something I will do by the time my career is over, is have my own brand. I really, really want to. And actually, maybe it's something we can talk about later in today's podcast. But it was so interesting because one of the things I asked him was, do you guys think you'll eventually get into footwear? Because that's the natural transition. Once you establish your brand and a foothold with a consumer in apparel, the next step to build to the next level is to introduce footwear. And he said, unequivocally, never going to do it. And one of the things that he used as rationale was because automatically they go to war with all the big brands who are much larger and better funded and have more relationships with retailers, and you just end up playing a different game, going back to what are you optimizing for. And he and Bandit have, I think, a really important partnership with ASICS. So ASICS recognizes that Bandit's creating this relationship with a different consumer, probably a younger, more urban consumer, just based on their look and feel. ASICS wants relevance with Bandit's core customer. Bandit obviously has an opportunity to deliver that value to ASICS, and simultaneously, ASICS probably has a lot more resources to boost Bandit. So an interesting synergistic relationship there. And I thought an interesting way to think about, as we've talked about in the podcast before, like when do you double down at the thing you're successful in and when do you try and expand into other categories? Even going back to episode 1 with Lululemon and the Further Project and their whole footwear, entry into that market. So anyway, I'm a big fan of Bandit and the team behind it. And yeah, glad that we could chat about him on the podcast here.
Yeah. One other thing that was brought up in the Brand Brothers podcast that I referenced that Jordan was on was how Bandit had actually capitalized on a lot of the run groups, the run meetup groups that are kind of popular across the country right now. And brands like Nike haven't actually capitalized on these big social running groups that are happening across the country. So it's interesting how there are so many different ways to be relevant with these younger urban consumers that live in large cities that can meet up and do these different things. Whether I don't even know the names of all of them, but there are quite a few different ways to be social, run around a city. Bandit seems to have done a pretty good job reaching out to those people, whereas some of the bigger brands haven't been nimble enough to do that. Actually, that makes me think of a different conversation that I had actually on the 4th of July. I was with someone who worked for On Running and used to be ex Nike. And the question that I asked was, how much of what you're doing is based on your expertise from working at Nike? And how much of what you're doing is based on the stuff that you wanted to do at Nike, but you weren't allowed to do? And I actually didn't get an answer to the question because we were interrupted by one of our children. But this really, drives that question home of like, is Bandit doing stuff that like Nike could never do? You need to be more nimble to be able to react to stuff like that. And these smaller challenger brands that we've been focusing on are able to actually capitalize on these moments, like being clever around the Olympic trials, connecting with the regional run clubs, doing more grassroots stuff that's actually driving real word of mouth, and collectively is starting to kind of make a dent in some of these bigger players.
Yeah, it's funny. So just going back to the conversation that we had at that dinner at TRE, he also said, okay, if you're going to do footwear, that automatically then splits your marketing spend too. And you have to start telling two different stories. He's like, right now, all we have to say is we're the best apparel, we're the best apparel, we're the best apparel. And eventually that consumer who's exposed to that message, however many times, may be willing to give us a try. And in that case, they then are welcomed into our ecosystem. Hopefully they create a lifelong customer. But if you also have to tell the story of we're also the best footwear, maybe the initial message gets diluted and you lose focus. Maybe you're no longer the best apparel and you're not the best footwear. And then you can see a vicious cycle ensuing. And it reminds me also that the retort that Michael Brandt had, the CEO of Ketone IQ, is like, yeah, we always get asked when we're going to introduce a ketone shot with carbs in it. And he said, I have the same answer. We're never going to do it because automatically we go to war with GU and Morton and all these energy gel companies. And right now we can play, we can be friends with all of them and we can do partnerships and collaborations and, sort of own our little space and have one singular message. So I think just something interesting that's stuck in my head now for almost a year since that conversation. And like I said, since then, I've been a massive admirer of the Bandit brand and have been following along with all their amazing success. I've heard that they're the fastest growing brand in running right now, and they're really only focused on road and track. So it'll be also interesting to see if maybe they try and eventually speak to the trail consumer too and be, if there's crossover between those performance and outdoor audiences, like we've talked about on the pod a bunch of times.
I know a great media outlet to talk to if that's the case.
Hit me up. Anything else on Bandit? We can close with BPC.
I think we're ready for BPC.
Heck yeah. All right, I'm going to go first this time. And this is a perfect segue. I've got two, one that's quick and one that's a little bit deeper. I'm going to start with the deeper one. So I wish I had my prop with me. I see it on the other side of the room. But Freetrail has finally launched our first performance product. It's a white bucket hat. So occasionally on BPC, I get to show my own stuff, right? So I talked about the Speedland shoes a couple weeks ago. We made a cool white bucket hat, and it's our first try sort of going to a manufacturer and creating our own product rather than just like printing a t-shirt like you see on my chest right now. And they're freaking awesome. And we're flexing a new muscle. And as you and I have talked about over time, I want Freetrail to behave more like a brand than like a media company. And it feels like this is one little baby step in that direction where I'm learning more about what it takes to create products. And then the idea is that we've already got this distribution through our media channels, podcast, YouTube, newsletter, etc. So over time, why don't we use those platforms to, sell our audience products that we've made ourselves and that we inherently believe in? So this is a tiny step in that direction, the Freetrail bucket hat. If you want to check it out, you can go to shop.freetrail.com, grab yourself a bucket hat.
Okay.
And then feel free to, you can follow up on that if you want. But the other quick one, I'm reading Danny Meyer's book called Setting the Table. So it's a business book, but it's focused on the restaurant industry, food and beverage more generally. Really, really good book. I would absolutely recommend it. I'm somebody who started my career in the hospitality space. I worked in hotels and restaurants for a while, and I've always really looked up to the people that kick ass in that industry. I think because it's so hard and it's such a labor of love and it's so artistic in a lot of ways. And so much of it is oriented around service. And that's something that I try and keep front of mind, especially when I get bogged down, is like, okay, remember that this needs to be something that's of service. It's not all about like making a bunch of money. And anyway, Danny Meyer's book is really great and really, I think, drives home how special the restaurant business is and just how hard it is to be successful in that space. Even if you are hyper talented, there's so many variables that go into, you know, staffing and location and long-term leases and staff turnover and, you know, keeping everything fresh and sourcing all your ingredients. It's just a massive maze of problems to navigate. So the people who are successful in that industry, I feel like, can be successful in anything. Danny Meyer is sort of top of the list. His book is something I would definitely recommend, Setting the Table.
Setting the Table. Very cool. Very cool. I've got a book. I won't include it in today's BPC because I've got 2 already, but I've got a book about designing for learning that I'll bring up on a future BPC. My first one that I have is actually a fellow friend of ours who also just recently ported all of their content over to Substack, which is where the Second Nature newsletter also resides. So I'm going to put this not only in the newsletter, but we'll put it in our newsletter recommendations. It's called Brand New Story. And Dre Sortis, he used to be the editor of the Red Bulletin, who I know you've probably connected with at one point or another. He also worked at Apple, and then he's done a ton of consulting over the years. But he really digs into brands and just tells these incredible stories about how brands use heritage, how they build bridges, how they show patience. And his newsletter is one of those that when it hits your inbox, you just like minimize all the other windows and really dig into whatever it is. He's an incredible writer, but he's talking about stuff that we actually really care about too. And Brand New Story is by far one of my top newsletters that I read on a weekly basis. So I'm going to link that in our newsletter. Definitely check that one out. That is my content of the whole thing. The other BPC that I have today is a callback to the very beginning of the discussion today about the top of the funnel. And on Thursday of this week, I'm headed to LA. I'm meeting with someone that I met at Sea Otter, who basically they live in China and they are building the mountain bike world in China. Basically, they are responsible for putting on events, putting on trade shows, working with athletes, just building the entire environment for mountain biking to grow in China. And of course, having educational content like I do is a perfect fit for getting more and more people in. And we've seen over the years that China is developing endurance sports, putting on events, sending athletes all over the place to compete. And that's, I think, coming up. It's happened in a lot of running stuff. I think you could probably share more than a few examples. We haven't really seen it so much in mountain biking yet, but I think we're at the precipice of exactly that. And so right now I'm actually working on taking my content and essentially translating it into Mandarin with subtitles and putting it on basically the Chinese equivalents to YouTube and Instagram and of course TikTok and everything like that over there with subtitles, with all the information to help the audience in China actually become better at riding mountain bikes. So that's another project that I'm working on right now, and hopefully our trip to LA is incredibly successful. But what that could mean for not only growing Super Rider but growing the sport of mountain biking, we'll see.
So good, man. All right. So I already subscribed to Brand New Story. Andreas, was he the guy who interviewed me for the Red Bulletin podcast back in the day?
Yep, that
I
was
still
him.
remember that guy. I'm so looking forward to digging into this. It looks like he's 15
You're gonna love
newsletters
it.
deep, so I got an archive to sift through. This is truly center of
There's
the
a
bullseye stuff for Debo here. I love studying and learning about brands and what makes them successful. So I'm already subscribed.
there's a there's a good one you may want to start with called Sporty Brands, and he digs into this one. I think it's like a French company that there's there's a French company that champions walking. So it's not necessarily about running. It's not about any sort of sportive performance. It's just focused on walking, and they just go deep on that, which I think is really kind of fun. So yeah, have fun with all of the stuff in his archive. And again, we'll link it in the newsletter and everywhere else that you can hear this.
All right, dude. Well, let me know when we need to get the Free Trail channel translated to Mandarin too. I know the trail running industry and ecosystem is exploding in Asia and specifically in China. So that's so cool, buddy. Well, keep us posted on that stuff too. I'm sure our listeners will love to hear it. So to our listening audience, as usual, go to secondnature.media, put your email address in, subscribe to the newsletter. We have some plans for how we can build that newsletter out here in the coming weeks and months. Make sure you follow us on Instagram. And also, maybe most importantly, get us over 2,000 over on LinkedIn. Aaron, you just said we're teetering on the precipice right now.
We're right there. We're right there. Yeah, I think LinkedIn is even rounding up at this point. So,
Yeah. Well, buddy, yes, great to catch up. I hope our listeners value us sort of sharing the inner workings of our own individual businesses here in public on the podcast, and also so fun to just chat about Raid a little bit more, chat about Bandit. Again, we've had this running theme of these challenger brands. Both Bandit and Raid very much represent that in running and in outdoor independently. I'm probably going to use Raid as a BPC once Kyle sends me some of that run product. But yeah, so fun to finally get back together on the pod and catch back up a little bit.
Yeah.
Likewise.
Okay.
So to our viewers and listeners, thanks so much for tuning in. Follow us on all those different digital platforms. We'll be back in your podcast feed again next Friday. Peace out.